I love movies. My parents are here today. They can vouch for the fact that ever since I was a kid, I was nuts about film. And it is in that spirit that I'm going to introduce you to a very good friend of mine today. Walt Disney, or technically the Walt Disney Company and its dozens of subsidiaries. It is the second biggest media conglomerate in the world by revenue. It made about $55 billion last year alone in revenue, and its current net worth stands at about 96. And it is the Walt Disney Company that gave us these very special ladies. They are the Disney princesses. They are an official lineup, and you may be wondering where these guys are. But I'll get to that in just a second. I promised you a talk on power and problems. So let's start with the better one, shall we? The power of the Disney princesses. There are two respects in which I think you can best measure this. That's revenue and reach. And in terms of revenue, there are two main sources of that for the Disney princesses. The first being films. Now, aside from the fact that for a lot of the early ones, they were the highest grossing Disney films the years they came out, there have also been a number of live-action remakes, both in film and TV in the years after. But you know what? The most recent one took it to a whole other level. Frozen is the highest grossing animated film ever made. It took $1.3 billion at the global box office. And just behind it, a few years later, was the live-action remake of Beauty and the Beast, starring the beloved Emma Watson, that made $1.2 billion. These are incredibly successful films. But they're not the most successful aspect of the Disney Princess franchise. For that, you really have to look to the merchandise. And when we look at the global merchandise revenue of 2016, we see a really interesting picture. Now, just to put this in context, these are the merchandise sources owned by the Walt Disney Company, just to give you an idea of how big they are. These are the top earning merchandise sources in the entire world. These are the Disney Princess franchise and Frozen, the film of those final two princesses, respectively. In 1 year alone in merchandise revenue, the Disney Princess franchise made $2.7 billion. Frozen made $1.6 billion, just those two princesses on their own. And many have speculated, and I agree, that this is why Anna and Elsa, the Frozen princesses, weren't introduced into the official Disney Princess lineup. Quite frankly, they don't need to be there. Those girls are making plenty of dollar all on their own. Because they were going to be introduced into the lineup, but then Disney never quite did. And this is basically the reason why. But the even more interesting thing, obviously, like individually, they perform very well. But if you do consider the Frozen sisters to be part of the official lineup, which basically everyone does, then the Disney princesses are, without a doubt, categorically, the most profitable merchandise source in the world in 2016. And they remain that today. Just to put that in perspective, they made $4.3 billion in 1 year alone. That is over 8% of Disney's entire 2017 revenue. It is 4.5% of their entire current net worth. They are an incredibly powerful tool, but just for a bit of fun, let me show you what this merchandise actually looks like. How do they make this much money from these guys? You have, obviously, the classic dolls and their numerous variations in whatever form they come in. You have the famous costumes and pretty much anything else you could possibly imagine. I'm talking cheddar, Monopoly sets, deodorants, underwear, it's all there. And not to be left out, the Frozen sisters have their own versions of all of these as well, with some even more hilarious pieces of products. My favorite here are the food products. You have like 3 different types of cheese, turkey sausages, satsumas, champagne, little imprints you can put on your toast, all with Anna and Elsa's faces just emblazoned over it. But the thing I want you to remember about merchandise is that it isn't just a measure of profit. It's a measure of exposure. This stuff is in our homes. It's very prominent in particularly young women's lives. And so when I talk about the reach of these characters, merchandise is partly a measure of that. But to make it even more convincing, and even more tangible, put your hand up if you have ever heard or seen any of the names Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, seen any of these pictures before, aware of any of these stories, know any of these women. Hands nice and high. Have you ever heard any of those words, any of those names? Take a look around. Is there anyone sitting beside someone who doesn't have a hand up? There's not a single person in this room who doesn't know these characters, and I would challenge any of you to find anyone in your lives who isn't aware of them. So, having hopefully convinced you of just how powerful these characters are, I now have to introduce you to a notorious test to get at what the problem with them might be. It's called the Bechdel test. You really can't do a talk analysing the depiction of women in film without mentioning it. It's taken to be a really rudimentary measure of depicting women in films. And for any uni-goers here like myself, don't worry, it's really easy to pass this test. There are only 3 things you have to do. Do you have at least 2 verbal, named women who talk to each other about anything other than men? That is literally all you have to do to pass this test, is fulfill those 3 criteria. Seems like pretty obvious, right? I don't know if a woman here has ever gone a day in her life without talking to another woman who has a name and speaks about something other than men. And yet, when you go to the BechdelTest.com, where there are over 7,500 movies analysed by these criteria, you will find that actually a startlingly high proportion of them fail the Bechdel test. 44% to be precise. 10% of those fail one of the tests, 22% of them fail 2 of the tests, and the remaining 10% fail every single test on that very, very rudimentary list. Now, although this picture has improved, definitely, the pass rate is definitely going up, the thing that I really want you to take home from the Bechdel test, in addition to thinking differently about some of your favourite movies maybe, is that it makes us pay attention to what is seen and what is heard in a film. Who is seen? Who is heard? And that's what I want to use to structure the discussion I'm going to give on the Disney princess films. Because in all of those respects, they have undeniably been improving as the years go on, right? The narratives that these incredibly powerful heroines engage in have been getting more progressive. You've been seeing them take charge of their lives more, right from Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, who just laid immobile, waiting to be saved, up to Merida, Anna, and Elsa, who save their people, fight, and defend the ones they love. But what are the remaining little nags? Well, let's think back to the Bechdel test. Let's think about what we hear in these films. I'm going to be talking about a really interesting piece of sociolinguistic analysis by 2 really cool linguists called Fort and Eisenhower, who extracted and digitally analysed all of the audio from the Disney princess films. And this is some of the information they found. If you look at the percentage of male to female speaking roles in these films, which are almost exclusively led by women, there are always more male speaking roles than female, with one exception. Now, the lowest is obviously Aladdin, but as the name kind of gives you a hint, you're like, well, that's the one that's led by a male star, Aladdin himself, so we'll brush that off. Actually, the highest performing is Cinderella, the only one to achieve parity between male and female speakers, and all the rest of them have fewer female speaking roles than male. But, I hear you say, Zara, as you have said, these are films led by women. Presumably the female characters speak way more than all of the smaller ones, and so if you were to look at the percentage of lines spoken, not the percentage of speaking roles, you'd see a really different picture. Maybe not so much of a different picture. As you can see, on average, men still talk 3 times more than women in these films, even though they're led by female characters. The lowest is still Aladdin, but we've made our peace with that. The start of the drop actually comes with The Little Mermaid. Before that, there were equal or greater number of female spoken lines in the films. For those of you familiar with the storyline of The Little Mermaid, you might think, well, Ariel loses her voice right at the start. Sorry, she gives up her voice right at the start. I'll brush over the questionality of that. So maybe that's why there are so many fewer female speaking lines in that film. But as you can see, that trend continues on. And it's not until very recently that it gets better. And actually, the reason why Fort and Eisenhower think this drop happens is because it was at this time that the Disney princess movies entered their Renaissance era, as it's so called. Really influenced by the popularity of Broadway musicals that had these big ensemble casts, that trickled through to the movies, where their cast size hugely increased, and as it did, the gender inequality increased too. Because when they added a shopkeeper, or a librarian, or an inventor, it was male by default. Male was the norm. All of the sidekicks are notoriously male. And that means that even when you get up to the most recent film, the first one to have not one but 2 female leads, it still only has 41% of its lines spoken by women. And so what, you might think, but these films are watched by very young, very impressionable young people, and myself, but them too. And what happens when you don't have nearly as many women opening their mouths as men? You lend the impression that female speech isn't as common, isn't as valued, isn't as important as male speech. And in a world where we're trying to get women to speak up more at work, to open their mouths in meetings, to have a voice, this is definitely problematic. In fact, the best performing film is another very recent one, Brave. And I want you to remember it, because I'm going to come back to it in just a second. For now, let's get on to the second part of the problem. Here we're now at what is seen. Okay, so we run into something kind of funny and definitely cute called the baby face overgeneralization effect. And what this is the phenomena where we tend to perceive those who have childlike facial features as having childlike traits, and we treat them accordingly. You only need to look at a baby to understand what these traits might be. You have the large wide-set eyes, the high eyebrows, the really big forehead, the shrunken nose, the shrunken chin. Gee, I'm just trying to think, I've seen that somewhere before. Really large wide-set eyes, high eyebrows, big forehead, shrunken nose, shrunken chin. Oh yeah, sorry, it's every single one of the Disney princesses, right? These supposedly strong, unique characters that all look like babies. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, I promise. And although you might think there hasn't been a lot of work done on it, there wasn't a lot of work done on the line analysis that Fort and Eisenhower did, there has been a lot of research done on the baby face overgeneralization effect. So what are these traits that we associate with people with more babyish features? Well, weakness, submissiveness, lack of intellectual astuteness. And though you might think, you know what, these are actually all pretty appropriate traits to associate with babies. Like, it's understandable that we instinctively correlate those traits with those facial features because that's what babies are like, right? Yeah, that seems fine. Do you know what? It's even fine for some of the early princesses. But the more you go on through the lineup, the more you realize that actually these are really inappropriate characteristics for a lot of these characters. Elsa isn't within 1 million miles of any one of them. So why is it that they all look like babies? I don't know. And just to highlight for you the absurdity of some of these proportions, Rebecca Haynes notes that even though the narratives a lot of the recent princesses have improved, their eyes are still bigger than their wrists. And yeah, it's true, Anna and Elsa's eyes are bigger than their wrists, but you know what? They're not alone. They're not alone. Every single princess has eyes almost twice as big as her wrists. It's an absurd proportion. And a similarly absurd one is our very popular favourite, the waist-to-hip ratio. Now, a larger ratio means a larger difference between someone's waist circumference and their hip circumference. And for any woman or man in the audience, you will know that often that's not a very big difference, right? Unless you're Kim K, I suppose. But Lauren Brantz kindly edited some of the Disney princess photos for us to show us just how these girls would look with real waists. And it makes you realise how absolutely absurd some of the original proportions are. Look at Jasmine. Her waist is about the width of her eye. Imagine if my waist was the width of my eye. I'd fall over. It's absolutely insane. And this isn't just an artifact of when you transform something into a cartoon form, because as we saw in 2015 when Lily James played the live-action remake of Cinderella, she had an absolutely minuscule waist. There was a lot of journalistic and social media commentary on it. People were freaked out. They criticised it. There was talk of a corset, confirmed. Photoshop, denied. It wasn't good. Just 2 years later, when Emma Watson was in the live-action remake of Beauty and the Beast, there was no constricted bodice, and there was definitely no corset and no Photoshop. In real life, she has very similar proportions to Lily James, and she appeared just that way in the films. And you know what? She was described as having reinvented the Disney princesses, having brought them into the modern age. Thank God! Thank you, Emma. Thank you to the costume designers and the people who listened to the commentary from the Cinderella film and thought, you know what? We're going to do something a bit better. Now, there was actually one of the cartoon character princesses that also had really realistic proportions, but she ran into her own problem. This is Merida, the lead character of Brave, the film I flagged to you earlier that had a really great percentage of female spoken lines. This is how she appears in the film, as made by Walt Disney Pictures. This is how she appears in merchandise, as sold in the Walt Disney Store. She's had some makeup put on, she's got some hair extensions in, her dress has been transformed into a slinky off-the-shoulder number, her waist is almost halved, her practical utility belt has become a sort of sash, she's completely lost her bow, and she's just generally been blitzed up. And to anyone with eyes, you can see that these two pictures, even without knowing what the characters stand for, are representing very different things. Merida is brave, feisty, strong, talented Scottish princess. Right? That does not convey those values to me. And you know what? It didn't to the co-director of the film either. She was appalled at what Disney marketing had done to this character, making her sexy and skinny. And she rightly points out that it reflects a really narrow-minded view of what's going to make money. Clearly, Disney marketing didn't think that the real Merida was marketable, but this princessized version of her would. And she's not alone. Think of, if you will, an adventurous reader and a courageous warrior. Disney has created such princesses for us, thank the Lord. Belle and Mulan, respectively. Now, this is how they appear in the films when they're in these modes, reader, warrior. But they also appear in the films in very different modes. Belle as a glamorized hostage, Mulan as a matchmaker reject who doesn't look like she's going to get a husband because she doesn't really like to wear makeup. Now, which of these versions do you think Disney marketing chose to put into doll form when they were selling these characters? This is what you get in stores when you try and buy a Belle doll or a Mulan doll for your little girl who wants to grow up to be just like her. It seems, as Elizabeth Colts rightly points out, that for Disney marketing, personality is secondary to appearance. Just let that sink in. What you look like is more important than who you are. And nowadays, we're very much trying to push against that kind of message, right? And I'm going to say to you what I said to a group of young entrepreneurs a number of years ago. People are going to tell you that your principles will cost you. Believing that women should look like real people and not like cartoons is going to cost you. You're not going to be able to sell that. Well, if something is priceless, like your principles should be, figure out how to make it earn what it deserves, not cost what it doesn't. Just to drive home the personal resonance of this whole personality is a less important thing, right? 7 years ago, The Guardian came out with an article entitled, "Was Zara Brownless's young apprentice victory down to her dress?" I'd won a national, televised, competitive business show, the first and only year it won a BAFTA, and a well-respected newspaper chose to make their only commentary on it about what I was wearing in all the boardroom scenes. Never mind my skills, they said. What people really cared about was that dress. Apparently it threatened to usurp me, God forbid. And even Lord Sugar himself felt it the only thing worthy of commenting on when he tweeted about my victory later. But just as it was absurd to prioritize my appearance over my personality at that moment, it's absurd to do it with the princesses as well, as David Trumbull shows in his real-life princesses photo series, where he takes real-world female heroines and princessizes them. You've got political activists, Malala Yousafzai, Gloria Steinem, Rosa Parks. You've got presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. You've got scientist Marie Curie. You've got Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And not that you would know that from looking at these pictures, because they're unrecognizable. There is nothing about what those women stand for or what their personalities are about that comes across in the way they look. Nothing at all. He was trying to show how necessary it is to paint women with a specific mould, a superficial brush, a limited template. And it is ridiculous when you look at those pictures. They're unrecognizable. He rightly notes that fiction is the lens through which young people first perceive role models. And if he's right, which I think he is, then the Disney princesses are an incredibly potent lens. Now, yes, they have improved leaps and bounds in previous years. But the reason why I highlight these things that they can still improve on is because I, like millions of people around the world, love these characters, love these films, remember their stories. So this isn't really a talk about the power and problem of princesses. It's a talk about their potential. Thanks very much.